The first time the lights went out, Elena thought it was just bad wiring. The second time, she blamed the building. But the third time, the lights went out at the exact moment she whispered her father's name in the dark. And that was the moment she started to wonder. This story begins in Chicago in the late 1980s, in one of those old neighborhoods where the wind coming from Lake Michigan whistles between the buildings like something alive. The city was rough in those years, especially in the older parts where brick apartment blocks stood shoulder to shoulder, their windows rattling every time a cold gust moved through the streets. In one of those buildings, on the 3rd floor, lived a young woman named Elena. She was 22 years old, recently alone in a way she had never imagined she would be. Her mother had died when she was a child, and her father had raised her by himself. He had always been a quiet man, serious, dependable, the kind of person who rarely spoke about emotions but showed his love through everything he did. For Elena, then the illness came suddenly, and it moved fast. Within months, the man who had always seemed unshakable was gone. Elena watched the strongest person she knew fade away in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and silence. When he died, the apartment she returned to felt empty in a way she could not describe. Every object reminded her of him. His old coat still hung near the door. His pocket watch rested on her nightstand. Even the quiet of the evenings felt heavier. She tried to continue with her life. Every morning, she took the train downtown and worked an entry-level job in a small office building. The work was repetitive and dull, but it kept her mind busy enough during the day. The problem was the nights. When the sun went down and the apartment grew quiet, the grief returned stronger than ever. She would sit alone in the living room thinking about the last conversation she had with her father, wondering if there were things she should have said. It was during one of those lonely afternoons that Elena wandered into a small occult shop on Wabash Avenue. The place was narrow and dimly lit, with shelves full of tarot cards, incense, strange books, and objects she barely understood. At first, she was just browsing, but then she saw it on a lower shelf, a Ouija board, still sealed inside a simple cardboard box. The packaging promised communication with spirits. Elena stood there for a long time staring at it. She did not really believe in things like that, but grief has a way of making people consider possibilities they once dismissed. Eventually, she bought it. She carried the board home in a plain brown bag, almost embarrassed by the purchase. Once inside her apartment, she placed it in the closet and closed the door. She told herself she was not actually going to use it. It was just a strange impulse, nothing more. But even sitting untouched in the dark of the closet, the box seemed to weigh on her mind. Not long after bringing it home, small things in the apartment began to feel unusual. At first, it was easy to ignore. The lights would flicker occasionally when she switched them on. Old buildings often had electrical issues, so Elena blamed the wiring. One evening, she was reading in bed when the lamp above her flickered twice and suddenly went dark, leaving the room in silence. She sighed, climbed out of bed, and flipped the switch again until the light returned. It seemed like nothing important, just one of the inconveniences of living in an aging building. But the flickering kept happening. Some nights, the lights would dim slightly before returning to normal. Other times, they would go completely dark for a moment and then come back on. Each time it happened, Elena felt a small thread of unease tighten in her chest. Still, she tried to convince herself there was a simple explanation. The real uneasiness began one night when she woke up feeling thirsty. The room was dark except for the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. As her eyes adjusted, she noticed something standing in the far corner of the room. At first, she thought it was a trick of the shadows, but the shape did not move the way shadows normally do. It stood tall, almost touching the ceiling, darker than the darkness around it. There were no clear features, no face, no arms she could clearly see. Just a tall, unmoving silhouette that seemed to absorb the dim light around it. Elena sat frozen in bed, her heart beating so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She blinked several times, hoping the figure would disappear the way illusions sometimes do when your eyes adjust. It did not disappear. The shape remained exactly where it was, silent and motionless. The air in the room suddenly felt colder. A strange pressure seemed to fill the space, as if the presence itself carried weight. After what felt like several minutes, Elena finally slid out of bed and slowly backed toward the door without taking her eyes off the corner. Once she reached the hallway, she hurried to the living room and stayed there for the rest of the night with the lights on. Over the following days, the strange moments became harder to ignore. One evening, while she was preparing a simple dinner in the kitchen, the blender sitting on the counter suddenly started running. The loud whirring noise filled the small apartment, making her jump back in shock. She rushed toward the counter to switch it off, but when she grabbed the cord, she realized something unsettling. The appliance was not even plugged in. The cord hung loosely beside the outlet, completely disconnected. The blender stopped a moment later, leaving the kitchen quiet again. Elena stood there staring at it, trying to convince herself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe she had imagined the sound. Maybe the machine had briefly powered on from leftover electricity. But deep down, she knew that explanation did not make sense. Soon, another disturbance began to haunt the apartment. Almost every evening, just as the sun started to set, Elena heard footsteps coming from the apartment above hers. The steps were slow and steady, like someone pacing back and forth across the floor. At first, she assumed a new tenant had moved in upstairs. Occasionally, the sound was joined by faint laughter that sounded like children playing somewhere in the distance. But the noises never followed a normal pattern. Some nights, the footsteps continued for hours. Other times, they stopped suddenly in the middle of the evening, leaving an uncomfortable silence behind. Eventually, Elena decided to check. One evening, she walked up the narrow staircase to the 4th floor and knocked on the door of the apartment directly above hers. No one answered. After waiting a moment, she gently tried the door handle. It opened. Inside, she found an empty apartment covered in dust. No furniture, no personal belongings. The windows were bare, and the air smelled faintly of something dry and old. It looked like no one had lived there for years. Later, she mentioned it to the building supervisor. The man looked confused and told her that unit had been vacant for a very long time due to structural problems. But the footsteps continued almost every night. By this point, Elena's nerves were completely frayed. She slept poorly, often waking in the middle of the night convinced she had seen that tall shadow again somewhere in the room. Whether it was her imagination or something else, she could not say. The presence always seemed just far enough away to remain uncertain, yet close enough to fill her with dread. Eventually, she could not stand the tension anymore. One night, she opened the closet and stared at the unopened Ouija board inside. The box suddenly felt like the source of everything strange in the apartment. Even though she had never used it, the idea of it being there made her uncomfortable. Without thinking any further, she grabbed the box, walked outside into the cold Chicago night, and carried it to the dumpster in the alley behind the building. She dropped it inside and closed the lid. From that moment forward, something changed. The apartment became quiet again. The lights stopped flickering. The strange noises from upstairs disappeared completely. Nights passed without shadows appearing in the corners of the room. Eventually, Elena moved away from Chicago and built a new life somewhere calmer. But she never forgot those weeks in the old apartment. Years later, when she told the story to her own child, she spoke about it the same way every time. Not like a ghost story meant to entertain, but like a warning. Because sometimes when people open a door hoping to speak with someone they miss, something else may be the thing that hears